What was your first job and what did that teach you?
So my very first job was working at the Great American Cookie Company in Brookwood Mall in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, and it actually taught me a very important lesson about supply and demand. So when I was in the back making all of the cookies, I did that really well, and I made so many cookies. And then I came out to realize that we'd have to have an army of people outside waiting for my cookies to buy them. So we ended up throwing quite a lot away. So it's pretty important to get supply and demand correct.
Did you take any home?
I ate so many cookies. I ate about 8 cookies a day.
Lived on chocolate chip cookies. Who are your mentors and what role have they played in your life?
I've had so many great mentors along the way, both personal life and business life. And for the most part, they've been people that I've either learned from or worked with. And I think back on everyone from high school, from my dance teacher in high school who really taught me a lot about life skills, all the way through to different mentors I've had throughout my career. So one of my mentors who helped me decide where to go to business school, for example, and then also mentors that have helped me a lot by putting me in things like the Aspen Institute in the Henry Crown Fellowship. So I really have a personal board of directors that I look to quite a lot in different parts and phases of my career as well as my personal life. So I think everyone should have a personal board of directors.
What are the proudest moments of your personal life and your business life?
Probably my personal life, I would say starting and finishing a marathon. I was never a long distance runner. I've always been a sprinter. So in business school, the second year, I had quite a lot of time on my hands. And so I decided to train for a race, and finishing that was actually a really big accomplishment for me. So I was proud of myself for that, and it's something that no one can take away once you cross that line. But I'm also incredibly proud of other people's accomplishments as well. So as I think about different milestones that friends have reached, publishing books, for example, Jenny Crumpton. Also, friends who've produced movies and seeing their trailers and seeing them really reach levels of success in their own field has been extremely important and very worthwhile to watch. From a business perspective, I would say that probably finishing business school in French. I didn't speak French when I went to business school in French.
Wow.
Thought I did, and later I realized I really probably didn't speak it well enough at that time to go to school in it, but certainly through the help of many, many tutors and hours, learned to do it. So I think for me personally, that was really important. And then as I think about different things I'm proud of, really seeing, for example, a team that I was working on when I worked for PepsiCo, the Target team, really banding together and pushing in really difficult circumstances to overcome challenges. I think really proud of groups of people and teamwork that get you across the line even in hard times. So that's something I'm really proud of.
What do you do during your free time to help you maintain balance?
I think we all have time. Everyone, it's hard to imagine that people are so busy and that they don't have enough time. I think for me, it's about how you decide to spend that time. And I frankly don't sleep much either. So I really do try to balance, and I obviously have a job in my daily life, and then I run a nonprofit on the side of that, and then I make sure that I have time for my family and friends, and also exercise. So what I know about myself is if I don't get exercise, then that's it, exercise and sleep and eat well. Those are 3 things that it doesn't give me the energy to continue on the schedule I have. So I think balance is extremely important.
What type of books do you like to read, and are there any business-related books that you would recommend in particular?
So business books, I've actually been really interested in the whole movement around Thrive by Arianna Huffington at the moment, and thinking about the 3rd metric and how we've defined success over the last bit of time can be a draining way to define it. And I think figuring out how to really thrive, to use her word, or how to flourish where you are, and how to make sure that you're aiming at the things that are both, mental, spiritual, and physical all together. I think those are really important things. So I've really enjoyed reading that book. The second one I've really enjoyed is a book called Quiet, and it's actually research on introverts and the power of introverts. And I know a few people who are introverts, myself included, and I've really enjoyed understanding how we fit in the business world and how we have one face to the public, but then how we recover our energy being really important. So those are two that I've really enjoyed reading recently. And then I'm a writer myself, so I love fiction, and in fact taking a class at Gotham starting next week again. And so I've just finished The Goldfinch, and for anyone wanting a great read, The Goldfinch is my favorite new book.
What is one quality about yourself or way of operating that you have that you believe is what has made you successful?
Perseverance. I think that it's one of the most important things, especially in the face of challenge, to really, keep going and to not let yourself be blocked and stopped by certain things. So for me, figuring out how to weave and how to detour and keep going is actually the thing that I've found the most useful so far in my career.
Why did you choose to build a career in strategy and marketing? What appealed to you?
I really like advising people, and I love, it's probably from having a little brother who's 6 years younger than me and getting to boss him around all the time when we were growing up. I really enjoy breaking down problems, and even in industries I'm not that familiar with, and figuring out how to take the learnings from things I do know about and helping others really think through ways to grow in particular. I just find it really interesting, and so that's what I would say.
Tell us a little bit about your educational background, and looking back from where you are now, what do you identify as the most important element of that education?
So I started at school in Birmingham, Alabama, and then I went on to Wake Forest University in North Carolina and was a business major there. So I think the transition between public high school in Alabama and a private school it really was a big jump and a big difference for me, going from what I would say is mostly rote memorization type learning into really thinking and having to apply knowledge. So that was a big jump for me, and I really enjoyed my time at Wake Forest. And then I decided, when I went to business school, I decided to make the choice of staying in Paris to go to business school. I was already working in Paris at that time, and one of my mentors I mentioned, he came into the discussion and really encouraged me to do something a little bit different than most Americans would do, or than most people actually would do, and that stay in their own culture and their own language. So I decided to take that opportunity, and I applied to a couple of French schools. One's INSEAD and one is HEC, and I decided to go to HEC because they taught in French. And I really thought that it would be a very important lesson in how other people learn, and the French system is incredibly difficult and incredibly
Really?
different to the American system.
In what ways?
The French have such a strong background in science and math. It's so impressive, and almost all the people in business school were engineers, which I think is pretty different than it is in the States. And just watching the way that they solve problems and watching how they really hone in very quickly on how to make things work was a great learning opportunity for me, particularly with a little bit more of a creative background for myself. It was interesting to then really gain those math and science skills from them. I think the thing that Americans do very well is present. So if I compare and contrast the two, I would say that the French have an incredibly deep base, and they can go very deep on problem solving, and Americans tend to skim the surface a little bit more, but we are very good presenters, and we spend a lot of time doing that, even from young ages. So I think it's not better or worse, it's just different, and when you get to experience both, you really can pull them together.
What is the role of continuing education in people's career based on your experience?
So I think it's extremely important. And for example, this year I ended up going to Harvard class really for finance for non-financial managers. And that was really important because even though I had done an MBA in finance, going through the class and really working across many different industries with about 100 different people just helped me get back into the groove of what it is about finance as it is in my industry, but how that translates into other people's industries. And so I actually think I would like to go to a class every year if I could, because it's just really important. It's also important for the network that you build when you're there, because then when you face a problem that you either haven't seen before, or you want to be creative about the way to solve it, it just helps you expand that network and of people to call and to be able to help them as well.
Tracey, you've worked in various genres of executive positions. You've worked in strategic management at Bain, consumer goods at Pepsi, retail at Footlocker. Give us a brief trajectory of your career and maybe talk a little about why it's important to diversify your skill set.
Sure. So I wanted to fight three big battles in my life, three big brand battles. The first was in the photography industry. So I wanted to work for Kodak, and I wanted to fight that Kodak-Fuji battle at that time. So this is going back to 1997. The second is that I really wanted to fight the Nike-Adidas battle. And so I in that case, chose the second largest player. In Kodak, I had chosen the first, and in Adidas, I chose the second. And then I wanted, again, to choose another battle, and I chose the Pepsi-Coke battle. And in that case, chose one of the biggest consumer goods companies in the world with PepsiCo. So I love brands, so I've really enjoyed going to market, both as a leader and as a challenger, and how those companies really can be quite different in the way they approach things. And I think as far as functional skill set, I've done everything from general management to strategy to marketing to finance. So through all of those things, I've managed to pull together a skill set that enables me really now to lead companies. And because I have just enough knowledge on each of those different skill sets to pull it together and really lead something forward. But I think it's important to at least touch different functions in your career so that you can understand even better what those functional experts can do.
You mentioned working both on the side of the leader and the side of the challenger. What are the good points and bad points about both of those things?
The leader's role should be not to compete with the challenger, but should be to break and to move the industry forward. And I think in the case of Kodak, I was there right at the turn of the digital age when it first started. And I remember there was a campaign that we were going to run for Y2K, the year 2000. And the head of marketing wanted to put a digital ad on the front page of every circular and every advertising that we did. And he got beaten out by the sales guys who wanted to run color negative film, 200 speed color negative film. We went with that. And, obviously Kodak today is where it is. So I actually learned an important lesson about the leader, not just looking at the competitor, but really looking to where the industry is going and how to get there quicker. So it was a great experience I had learning from that at Kodak. And then in the case of the challenger, I've worked for two challengers that behave pretty differently. So Adidas is a great challenger to Nike, but depending on where they are in the world, they are the leader in certain things. And I think that a challenger like Pepsi does, I think a challenger should look to the leader and should challenge them quite hard on multitudes of things. But I also think that they should look to innovate themselves. And so sometimes the challenger where they sit can become the leader by innovating.
What was your biggest setback or lesson?
I think the biggest setback, if I think about PepsiCo, it was working on a project around sugar reduction and how we really need to take the full portfolio of something that is, inherently bad for you, which is sugary drinks, and make that still a treat for people, but make it better for their health. I think it's something that for me as an athlete and as a coach, it's something that I struggled with to really work on and try to pull down the sugar content. I'm happy to see Pepsi's launching a new product that'll take stevia, put stevia into the mix instead of just HFCS. So I think a setback is when you're working on something that's very important and important to you as a value, and then because of changing business climates or because of competition, something changes. And for example, we went back to advertising on Blue Can Pepsi, and that's the full sugar version of Pepsi, necessary for business, difficult for me personally, as it doesn't completely square with my values on health and wellness. So I think always finding that balance of what's great for the marketplace and what consumers demand, but also holding true to what you value and what's important, fighting those battles within yourselves are important.
You've lived and worked all over the world. Tell us briefly about where you've been and what you've done and what it has meant for your career to work abroad.
I started on a 6-month project from Atlanta to Paris, and so now anyone that ever wants to go on a project abroad, I tell them, you'll probably come back 10 years later, so just be prepared. So I started in Paris, and I worked for Kodak there, and then I had worked for them for about 1.5 years, and then decided to go to business school. So I went to business school in Paris as well. And then following business school, wanted to work in the sports industry. And so the biggest sports competitor in Europe at that time was Adidas. So I went to headquarters and I worked in Germany in a tiny little town called Herzogenaurach outside of Nuremberg, and worked there for about 1.5 years, then moved to Amsterdam with them to call on the Footlocker account. which is where I now work. And from Amsterdam, then went to London. And London, I changed to consulting. I worked for Kearney and then for Bain in both London, Dubai, South Africa, and then Russia as well. So I've kind of been a lot of places. I guess the only place I haven't really touched is South America, so maybe that's in my cards at some point too. But the things I've learned, I think that business around the world is done differently. It depends on culture and what you start with and what you finish with. So in many cultures, it's very much about personal relationship first, and then business is after you establish trust. It's the thing that you then can get to, but you don't start with business right away. And also, there's a lot that I teach in my nonprofit around high and low context cultures, meaning, people like Americans typically are direct and we prefer email styles, just how to go about communicating. And then if I contrast that to the Middle East, everything's based on trust. And so you have everything in person, it's very hard to just send emails. It's all FaceTime on phones. And so it's just knowing how to flex style depending on who you're dealing with around the world is quite important. And when you get it wrong, you get it really wrong. And I certainly have learned from that as well.
At Footlocker, what is important to you in a team member or an employee that you hire? And how do you mentor the people who work for you there?
I think the single most important thing I look for is intellectual curiosity. So I think, if someone's just a well-rounded athlete, I can teach them, and a company can teach them quite a lot, but they have to be naturally curious. So instead of getting an answer and just letting it rest on that, it's how they continue to dive down to make sure that that answer resonates and that it makes sense and it's what they see in the marketplace. And so I think someone who's curious about whether it's data or consumers or sports, anything, as long as you continue to dig, then you can get really a robust answer. And I think that's important as I look around my team and I staff it up. I think that also a willingness to learn and an approach to that, how people are willing to take feedback and grow. It's been one of the most useful parts of my career is having great people give me feedback, both good and bad, but knowing what to do with that feedback and how to continue on the path forward. So that's what I look for: openness, intellectual curiosity, and then just horsepower as well. How strong people are in a certain function.
How exactly do you go about searching for, finding, and hiring the right people? I feel like that's something a lot of people struggle to know how to do well. Do you have a process that you use, or?
I do. It depends on what I'm hiring for and where. I think first off, I use my personal network. So because I have a great personal board of advisors, if I have a position come open, I'll reach out within that network, either to people I know and I'll bring them from another company, or I'll reach out through people that are trusted sources. And I think a lot of people do that more and more. The second way, I go through something like LinkedIn, and I'll find, sometimes I'll be looking for a certain type of person, and I can use networks like that. And then thirdly, I have a couple of really trusted recruiters and headhunters that help when they know my style now and they know what I'm looking for. So I've gotten some great candidates that way through the years as well.
How do you build a collaborative culture on your team?
For me, it's about setting the vision and making sure that that's well communicated, and then having everybody understand that vision, believe in it, and follow it. So it's very similar to having a sport or music or something that ties people together. You need a point of commonality to create a culture where people really row in the same direction, so to speak. And I think that doing that around something common, so vision, mission, core values, those kinds of things, I think they're very important to establish. Once you've done that, then it's easier to get people all going in the same direction. And people want to believe that life is bigger than what their job description may say. So I think it's also about helping people accomplish whatever goals they have as well, outside and inside work.
Talk a little bit about the state of retail today. What's going on? What are the big challenges? What's the difference between online and physical brick and mortar stores?
So it's a fascinating time to be in retail, particularly if you're a bricks and mortar retailer. We also have .com as well. And so just thinking about the transition between those things, thinking about going 10 years in the future, what percentage of business do we think will be online versus still in stores? And, really the consumer, the immediacy of all information at all times now. Everybody will walk into a retail store with their phone and they'll be looking up something, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a phablet or any of those things. Now, information is so immediate and it's so seamless that as you're approaching consumers, from the retail perspective, we need to not think about just .com and bricks and mortar anymore. Now it really has to be omni-channel going forward, which a lot of people are working on today. But the consumer doesn't necessarily make the differentiation between a physical world and a virtual world, so retailers have to get on board quite quickly and mirror that.
Tell us a little about Culture Relay, how you came up with the idea, what the model is, and why you decided to launch it.
So Culture Relay came about almost a year ago now. I was training for the New York Marathon, and I ran about 1,000 miles in preparation for the New York Marathon last year. And so I was about 144 miles into this training, and I was thinking about what I really love. And I really love a handful of things in this world. One is I love education. My mom's a professor. I've grown up around teachers and educators, so that's a very important part to me. The second is I really love high school girls. They're difficult, and it's a hard age to try to become yourself and find yourself, and I love that difficulty, and I love that joy as well. As you see people really make good decisions and bad decisions at that time, how you can influence them. So education, girls, I'm obviously a runner, I'm a running coach, so sports are very, very important to me. And the fourth part is culture and all the places I've lived, how you can learn to exist in a world and be of it from everywhere and yet headquartered in one place. I think those four things to me are what I wanted to combine into an idea. And I thought, this will never work. What would that idea even be? And so what we ended up doing is creating Culture Relay, which is about relaying culture back and forth between high school girls, but also running a relay race. And so Culture Relay is two things, and we go through an 8-week training to finish a significant road race at the end of it, and we teach life skills through that process. So everything from goal setting to planning to overcoming challenges, developing your network, developing stamina. These are types of things that we're teaching in classroom to classroom sessions. And then we're also pairing the girls up one-to-one in a virtual exchange. So they have a buddy on the other side of the world, just like your pen pals when we were younger. This time it's a virtual one. And so we're able to create a link between people who otherwise would never meet. And we're also able to do that virtually through a virtual exchange. So the idea is really to create an environment where people learn about each other. And I think that for me, the core is the more we know about each other, the less we fear things. And so if we can make the world a smaller place, that's how we'll all exist in a better way.
What have been some of the challenges that you've encountered, and what have been the rewards that you've experienced in this first year?
Oh gosh, the challenges, it's where perseverance comes in for sure. At first it's everything just knowing how to eat the elephant. So when you start a project, where in the world do you start? Do you start from the back office things like 501c3 setup, which is charity status with the IRS, or do you start with who are the girls? Do you start with what's the brand name? There's so many different things you can do, and it's all at once, all the time, and there's no way, unlike corporate America where my job is a little bit more set and I have expectations that I meet, this is that the expectation is, does it work or does it not work? So there are all sorts of ways to get there, and just understanding through process of elimination a little bit, how do you start, and then what do you have to do next and next and next, and how do you prioritize your energy? Certainly in the first 6 months I definitely did not sleep much trying to get it off the ground, and then I think over time you start to hire really key positions. So now I have a program manager who helps me a lot, and thinking through how to use your network and what has to be original to the program, and then what potentially can you learn from other people. So I have a spreadsheet going now with 254 names at the moment. I've had 254 coffees or dinners, so it's been a busy year, but it's actually the most rewarding thing for me to start over. I'm starting as a beginner in this field, and nonprofits do so much amazing stuff around the world. So many great mentors of mine have stepped in, and I've met them through this process as well. So it's just been an incredible growth position for me to be in. And you do things wrong and you do things right, and you hope you do more things right than wrong, but the key is to learn from all the things that don't work, so that you can really change them going forward. It's a fascinating ride and it takes a lot of energy, but I think it's well worth it when I see the girls and how much fun they have and how they're growing.
And what's the web address for Culture Relay?
It's www.culturerelay.org.
Great. Tell us a little about your Henry Crown Fellowship with Aspen Institute, what it is, what you do, why it's important for your career and for your lifelong learning.
The Aspen Institute is headquartered in Colorado, but also has offices in DC, and it's a continuing education type of place. And the Henry Crown Fellowship within that is a 20-person, 2-year fellowship, and it is aimed at taking people who are significant leaders in business and taking them from that place of competence to significance. So how do you take people who are entrepreneurs and business leaders today and really get them to think about creating good in the world? So quite a few of us now have gotten great projects off the ground. We work on our projects individually, so Culture Relay is mine as an example. And so throughout that 2-year period, we have 4 different meetings for a week long each time, and we're studying really different facets of leadership and reading a lot of material from different leaders and thinking about things like the leadership compass and how do you make trade-offs in business and how do you make trade-offs also in the world. So as that process evolves, you're not only building a great network of people who you can call really with any problem, but you're also learning how to create an organization and thinking about what you want to leave on the world as your mark, not from an ego perspective, but from a deliverable perspective. How are you going to make a difference, and how do you find meaning in what we do? So I think that Aspen's easily the most important catalyst I've had in my life, in my career so far. So it's something that's helped me launch Pad into nonprofit as well.
What do you think makes a good leader?
There are so many different styles of leadership, and that's something, I've seen effective leaders with so many different qualities, but I think, generally speaking, I think that a few values are really important as I look at the leaders that I follow and that I want to be. I think that trustworthiness and speaking with truth and candor is something that I really appreciate in leadership. I think having a vision and being able to communicate that vision is something that, as I look across the business world that I'm involved in, and also even political leaders or religious leaders, thinking about how they communicate ideas is extremely important. And then I think that how leaders treat others, how they create teams, how they lead from the front and from the back, depending on where it is in the cycle that they need to be. And the last part for me is really the downfall of most leaders. If they do downfall, it usually has to do with hubris. So I think making sure that people's egos are in check and that leaders are only as good as the people that they lead, that making sure that you remember that and remember where you came from, I think it's an important part for leaders to remember.
What has been your biggest risk that you've taken in your career?
Definitely going abroad, staying abroad, and I think transitioning from the corporate world that I knew pretty well, the consumer goods world, into consulting. Most people make that transition just after business school, and I made it as an experienced hire. So, consulting is something that you learn from the ground up. It's certainly a way of thinking and a way of doing things that doesn't necessarily allow for creativity outside the lines, let's say that. So I think coming in with a lot of experience into consulting is certainly a risk. It has given me a toolkit that is an incredible one, particularly from Bain Company. But I think that it is a risk because you come away from what you know very well, and then you conform to a certain set of ideals and ways of doing things that are important for that company, but may not be what is in your natural skill set.
Tracey, you are a high-level female executive in what could be considered a man's world. What has been your experience, and what do you think is important for women business leaders to know?
I've read a lot about female leadership and female mentorship, and I think for me, the major turning points in my career have been both with women and with men, and I think the ability to find great mentors is really key. it hasn't much mattered to me whether they were men or women, but I think that once you're in a situation as a woman in business or woman in a leadership position, the ability to reach back and pull people forward in that is quite important. So if I think about some of the turning points in my career, some of the most major launch pads have really come from women who looked at my skill set and looked at, even in some cases, the lack of my skill set and said, I think that's going to be important, so I'm going to push you on that particular point. And I think it's very important to make sure that we, both as a female network, that we do that going forward, and that also we make sure not to alienate people. So how there's so much in the press and so much important energy around females in the workplace. I also think that it's important to bring us all along, whether female, male, depending on, with race, with gender, everything should be really a group centered around common causes. And so I think it's both important for women to mentor other women, but I think it's also important to bring us together.
Do you see women leaning in from your perspective in business? What did you think about Sheryl Sandbergs' book?
I think that Sheryl Sandbergs' book is a great part of a long debate in the country, and I think that I don't so much want to comment on her book as I want to comment on the idea of women and how we come in and out of the workforce. I think it is tougher for women, especially women who decide to have families and decide to go through that amazing process. You know, being brought back into the workforce, I think, in a timely fashion where they don't lose their skill set that they've built over time. So allowing a little bit of flexibility in the workplace in order to make that happen, so that we can bring women back in before they sit out too long and then it becomes a skill set that's missing. I think it's important that we think through that. I think it's also important that people take individual responsibility for knowing that there's a certain amount of time, and depends on the person and the company, there's a certain amount of time that's kind of acceptable to be out, and then there are times when it becomes too much and life's moved too fast forward. So I think, for people who do want to have it all, if you will, just knowing how to balance those things is important, and knowing that corporations are trying to also get through a lot of work to make great products and put them on the market. So how do we, I think, have empathy on both sides, so women that make choices to do that, but also companies who need to run forward and need to innovate and need to have a working workforce that's there. I think it's a tricky balance, and I really sit on the side of having a working mom who worked 2 jobs. So obviously it's really, really important debate for me. It's a really important topic for me.
What do you think corporations need to be doing today to attract the right talent?
The world is wide open now for the way that young people can go about getting jobs and thinking about their careers. And as you know, if you read a lot about the millennial workforce, people jump careers and jobs quite quickly. So I think it's really important on the corporate side to make sure that not only are we thinking about career paths for those people, but also thinking about how to create meaning in careers. So I don't think people are interested anymore in joining a company and going 45 years and retiring in that company necessarily. So I think it's about people wanting to get into a job, into a career, and then create a well-rounded circle of experience for themselves. So from my perspective, it's very important to make sure that we're trying to answer the question around corporate social responsibility and how do we really create leaders in corporations who care about things other than just their company today, but care about the impact on the greater world. So I think that in the future, if not already right now, people are definitely going to be looking for corporations to really care about them as people and get them to care about the world, because I think it's very much about creating that kind of value and longevity in people's lives that's important.
In this economy and this job market, it's widely heralded that millennials are being told you're not going to be able to find a job when you come out of college. It's going to be very competitive. What advice do you give to young people just coming out of school?
I think that internships are really important, and it is true that it's hard to get an experience unless you have had an experience. So I think whatever it is, even if it's something that's in, that you work for unpaid internships for a while, or you do something that gets you on the path of what your goal is, that it doesn't much matter if you start in the exact position that you want in the end. I think it's important that it makes sense and that it's on a path toward what you want. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I got out of business school as an undergrad and just knew I had to get a job, any job, didn't matter what job. And I got a great job, but, looking back, if I had really thought about my career in 10 or 15 year increments or even 5-year increments, I may have made different choices as I started it. So being patient with, financial reward and those things will come in a career, but making sure that you think about what you love. What is it that makes you want to do that? So what products is it? What kind of industry is it? What values does it hold? Make sure that it really squares with what you are as a person, because I've found it much easier to work in industries, and I've worked in a lot, but working in industries where I have, personal interest in that industry, so that for me, when I'm reading about things after work, I'll find, I'm reading about my industry because it's what I love. So reading a Runner's World, for example, it's play for me, but it's also really important to what I do for a living. So making sure that you kind of get on that path and have passions that align with what you want to do, I think that's really important. So the advice I would give young people is to think about that, is to think about those things that you really hold dear and that you think are fun, because at the end of it, it's going to be a really long working life, right? It's 40 plus years for most of us. I mean, not Mark Zuckerberg, but everybody else. And so if it's a long life, how do you make sure that you create, meaning in that life, and that you have fun and that you like the people you're doing it with? I think that formal education has certain things that it absolutely has to do, right? So it has a certain skill set that it needs to teach. But for example, I don't think it fits everything. I don't think it pushes everything all the way to necessarily knowing how to get a job and how to dream big. So that's another reason I've created Culture Relay outside of the education space, but within kind of within a sports arena, because it's a lot of fun and you're learning as you go. So I think formal education is amazing, but I think it's also important to make sure that you understand as teachers, which I now consider myself to be, that we're educating all the time using different ways, using fun, using sports, and using group activities to really drive home some of those skill sets that might not seem as that they're being taught in formal education.
What do you think the most effective CEOs today are doing differently?
I'm working now currently with a great CEO at Footlocker, and I think what I enjoy about his style is that he doesn't claim to know all the answers, but he asks really good questions. And so if you have a huge workforce and you can't possibly know every aspect of everything legal or financial or strategic or whatever, I think that having curiosity and knowing how to drive the right questions, actually not only does it let you drive the organization forward because you get the answers, but it also allows people to feel part of that answer. And so, I've never actually seen him tell anyone to do anything. I've seen him question us all and challenge us through questioning, almost using the Socratic method. And it's a really interesting leadership trait to have. So I've had a good time learning from him this year.